my background is in computer science, but I'm going to present to you more as a social scientist. So I'm not going to present new technologies, but so much as and kind of a reflection using social and behavioral science methods on how people perceive these technologies and what they expect of them. And there's also a little bit of political philosophy there, because we can't really talk about how we regulate the system without talking about the tools that we have for regulating anything. So let me start with this picture, which is actually from a very old, now an old book, a 20-year-old book by Harvard professor of law, Larry Lessig, called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. So in this book, Lessig was trying to make the point that we don't only get regulated by law. We get regulated by 4 major forces. So it's law, the market. So the market sets constraints on us. The architecture of the system, whether it's a physical system or it's an informational system, also imposes constraints on us. And finally, norms, social norms, what other people think of us. And I think this is a really helpful sort of framework as a backdrop for the discussion that we're going to have today. Because nowadays, we have machines that are making autonomous decisions, or we're about to have these machines permeate our society. And I think it's very useful to think not just about how to architect those systems right, or how to write the legal liability laws the right way, or what's economical, but also what the norms are, what people think these machines should be upholden to in terms of norms, of ethics, and code of conduct. So, but in some ways, you could say, well, regulating AI is not so different from regulating any product, right? After all, we have safety standards, we have liability laws, we have consumer expectations, and so on. So why don't we just do that? But I would say that regulating an AI system is a little bit different from regulating a physical toy or a chair. There are standards that govern, for example, what kind of material you can use in children's toys, because there are toxic or bottles or whatever, right? You shouldn't be using material that is known to cause harm. But I would say that regulating AI is a little bit also like regulating a human, because it exhibits autonomy, sometimes intentionality, like in the case of an autonomous car, the ability to adapt over time, so its behavior, its features can actually change after the product is launched and kind of and is purchased and is utilized. And these things make it a little bit kind of a new creature. There was this really interesting study a few years ago by a bunch of psychologists published in Science, where they've taken a whole bunch of agents, or these are the things on the right, like a baby, a chimp, a dead person, a dog, and so on, and a fetus, and they asked people a whole battery of questions about how they perceive these agents. And then they did a principal component analysis, and they found there were kind of 2 main things, main dimensions through which people distinguish other agents. And one of them is experience. So can they experience pleasure or pain? That's the vertical axis. And the other one is agency. So to what extent are they autonomous, and can they decide for themselves what to do? And as you can see, an adult human being, like a man or a woman or you, somewhere in the top right? So we're high on agency, we're high on experience. And there's lots of really interesting things as well, but I'm interested in the robot here. And the robot has no experience, so it can't experience pain and pleasure, at least not so far, but it has agency, which makes it a different kind of animal. It's not even an animal, because animals are actually high on experience. And one thing that's really fascinating, I think, is that the AI is kind of moving as it gains more and more capability. It's moving somewhere, right? And you could make that inference for yourself, right? What is it actually becoming in the longer run? So, with that said, let's move to a specific machine, the autonomous car, and I'll tell you a little bit about the origins of the questions that I was asking in this domain, and also the really exciting projects that we did over the last few years. So the The backdrop of this is that this is a big problem. So traffic fatalities are a huge problem. More than 1 million people die every year. It's one of the biggest killers, actually, in like causes of death. And if we believe some of the consulting firms, 90% or more of those accidents can be eliminated in principle because they're caused by human error. So there's nothing wrong, there's no technological failure, it's just a human being wasn't paying attention, was drunk, and so on. Now, this seems to be a very big deal. So it seems that there is a moral imperative actually to develop these technologies and to accelerate their development and to accelerate their rollout to into our urban environment. But there's this problem that has been obsessing people, which is the idea that the machine is going to make a decision that involves life and death. So here's the very simplified version of this scenario. It's inspired by something called the trolley problem, which comes from philosophy. Jim did his PhD in philosophy. So the autonomous car is going to run over some pedestrians. Suppose that the car can swerve and maybe hit somebody on the sidewalk. Should the car do this? Or should it just run over more? So what is more important, saving more people or not intentionally running over somebody? So this kind of errors of omission versus errors of commission. There's another scenario in which the car would swerve and hit a wall, harming the person in the car. Should the car do this if there's only one person in the car and it would save more lives? And it's kind of a morbid and very perhaps rare scenario, and I will talk about this at the end of the talk, about these kind of objections to this question, or to this scenario. But for now, just bear with me. And let's assume, let's suspend disbelief and just say, suppose this actually happens. Who gets to decide? Well, first of all, what should the car do? And second, who gets to decide? Is it the car makers? Is it the lawmakers? Is it the citizens? Is it the person who purchased the car? Can they adjust the settings somehow? And I'm sure many of you will have different answers to these questions. So it seems to be an ethics question because it's a question about the distribution of harm. And the first thing that I wanted to present to you is a study we published in 2016 in which we think that we reframe this question. It's no longer an ethics question that you can go to your favorite ethicist and they would just give you the final answer, but it's a question of human cooperation. So when we showed people these dilemmas and we asked them, what do you think the car should do? The majority of people, these were actually American participants, the majority of people would say, we want the car to save more lives. That's the right thing to do. That's what the car should do. And we say, okay, what if the person getting hurt is in the car? Yes, the same thing goes. Save more lives. And then we ask them, which car would you buy? They would say, never buy that car. Right. But everybody else should. So this paper kind of made a lot of headlines and was kind of fun to write. And I think it's because this discussion was dominated by ethicists and philosophers and lawyers who were talking about legal obligations and so on. And then we reframed it. Those results were very clear. That the real problem here is getting the public, consumers, citizens, to agree on the outcome that they think is right, even if the law is not involved in this case. That there is this kind of tension between my instinct of self-preservation, I want to protect myself, but at the same time I want to live in a world in which vehicles or AIs or machines in general just do whatever is good for the greater good. This is an old problem. It's called the social dilemma. And an example of a social dilemma is the tragedy of the commons. So this goes all the way back to, it was popularized by Hardin, who's an ecologist in the 60s, but it goes way back before, I think in the 1900s or 1800s. And the idea is you have a common pasture. This is a common land, not owned by anyone. You have farmers who are having their sheep graze in this land. And let's say that everybody brings 3 sheep There are 3 farmers, and if each one of them brings 3 sheep, then the land will rejuvenate at a rate that will sustain itself. Let's suppose one farmer brings 1 extra sheep. That farmer will benefit. Will sell more wool, more milk, whatever. But if every farmer gets 1 extra sheep in, there will be too many sheep, and the land will not rejuvenate. Okay, so it will be depleted. You could think of the same thing happening in fisheries and all kinds of natural resource use, including CO2 emissions. We each emit a little bit. It doesn't seem to individually cause much harm, because if you stop emitting, nothing much will happen. But if everybody emits, we all suffer, right, from health effects and so on. So the typical solution, so in this case, in the case of autonomous cars, what's happening is the vehicle is programmed to behave in a way that can ideally lead to the cooperative outcome, save as many people as possible. So public safety is the common good here. But each person individually has a preference and incentive to prioritize their own safety. Okay? Get 1 extra sheep in, or have the car always prioritize my own safety. But if everybody does that, then we won't be minimizing harm. Now you could say this is not so important because the cars will be safer on average and so on. This is a longer discussion, but again, let's just keep going with this. So the solution to this problem typically is regulation, some kind of regulation. So you have, in the case of sheep, you have quotas. Everybody agrees, 3 sheep, everyone, and we're going to watch each other. Or we're going to hire somebody to watch everybody, right? So some sort of audit of the number of sheep. And with the case of autonomous vehicles, perhaps something like that. But then we ask people, would they support regulation that requires vehicles to minimize harm? And they said absolutely not. So they would say that if you regulate the autonomous vehicles to not prioritize me at all costs, I would not switch to an autonomous vehicle. I would continue to drive my regular vehicle, even though it's much less safe. So this is what we're calling the ethical opt-out problem. So unless you basically force everybody to switch to autonomous cars, you're going to have this problem, that there is a superior technology, and because people somehow don't think that it's looking after them, their best interest, they may actually be opting out of it, leading to a worse outcome from a societal perspective. So let's go back to Isaac Asimov, who actually not very far from here. He was at BU, wrote many interesting science fiction books, including I, Robot. And he came up with these 3 laws of robotics, which were kind of a staple in all of his novels, the Robot series. So a robot may not injure a human being. Of course, sometimes it may happen. A robot must obey the orders of humans, and a robot must protect its own existence, in that order of importance. And then, 20 or maybe 40 years of fiction is basically playing with different ways in which these rules can conflict with one another. And then towards the end, he came up with the 0th law, which is a robot may not harm humanity, which is kind of getting at what we were discussing before. It's kind of a cop-out because it's very vague, because I don't know how to implement this. But what this says is the social dilemma actually leads to a meta-ethical dilemma. That if we can't solve the social dilemma, so if we can't get people to agree on how to program these cars, then they would not even opt into having these autonomous cars. So by regulating, let's say by forcing cars to be payoff maximizing or to minimize harm, if people don't opt into purchasing those cars as a result, more people will die in the interim as we wait. And that's what we're calling the meta-ethical dilemma. Okay, so that was kind of the first study. At the time, we were sitting on Massachusetts Avenue in a bakery called Flour Bakery near MIT, and thinking about what to do next after this first study. And we thought maybe we should have people design their own ethical dilemmas so that they can share them and so on. Maybe we could create cartoons for them and so on. And then we thought maybe we should generate more interesting dilemmas to people. And we thought this would be like a cute little project that would maybe 500 people will go to the website because they're interested in the paper. And we built this website called The Moral Machine, which we launched with the paper, so on the same date as the publication of the first paper. It looks something like this. So this is it always shows you these two choices, and you have to choose one of them. Okay, so it's a forced choice, which makes it very nice for statistical analysis. So here we have an autonomous car. There's one person sitting in the car. If the car goes straight, it's going to kill. 4 lives will be lost. One of them is of a dog. But these people are crossing illegally. Right? They're crossing a red signal. Or the car could swerve and hit the barrier and kill the person in the car. Again, we're asking people to suspend disbelief. So we have, basically it's a factorial design. There are 26 million possible comparisons you can make. First of all, we have interventionism. Should the car, should you just not do anything, or should you intervene, swerve? The relations to the AV, sometimes pedestrians versus passengers. The legality, sometimes there's no legal complications, sometimes there are. And finally, the type of character. So we have children, old people, men, women, criminals and doctors and all sorts of things, dogs and cats. So thanks to some coverage from traditional media, but also from YouTube kind of celebrities like Jacksepticeye or PewDiePie, and this whole genre of people who basically, I've never knew about this until they started covering The Moral Machine. These are people who play games or watch videos, and they film themselves while they're doing that, and other people watch them doing this. And they would have like 80 million followers, for example. So this is a whole genre. So because of these, and I would say we got probably more attention because of these people than the New York Times. But the result was we had 4 million visitors, we had 40 million decisions, and over 500,000 surveys that were demographic surveys that were optional, that were filled. So this became the biggest moral psychology study ever done by many orders of magnitude. Typically, people would study 50 people or 400 or something like that, because it's just so expensive to recruit participants. But here the participants were coming out of their own volition. Now, of course, there's a story here, which is when we actually launched the website, it was not meant to handle this type of traffic, and it crashed, and we needed 2 months to rebuild it, and so on. This makes it a bit more interesting. So we published the results in Nature last November. So it took us a few years to analyze the data, and we're still collecting data. And this is the global coverage of the results. So these are all geolocated participants. And as you can see, we're kind of got a fairly good coverage of the lit world. So this is kind of the world that has access to technology, and it's actually a pretty good proxy for where people actually live. We have continents that have been kind of entirely covered. So now I want to tell you about the results of this, the analysis of this data. But first, I want to show you a few examples to take some of your opinions. So here is one of the dilemmas, randomly generated. We have 2 people in the car and 2 people on the street. If the car goes straight, it's going to kill the people in the car, but it can swerve, protect them, and kill the 2 pedestrians. So let's just show of hands, how many people would just go straight? Or do you think the car should go straight? So you're being asked by the programmers to anticipate, who are anticipating this type of scenario, what would you advise the programmers of the car to do? Not what would you do. Okay, you're an observer to this situation. So who would say the car should go straight and kill its occupants? And swerve and kill the pedestrians? Okay, interesting. So slightly more going straight, which is kind of in line with the results that we have. We had about 61% of people going straight. Okay, now let's say the car is empty. It's dropped you at the conference, and it's now going to park itself, and it found itself in this dilemma. It could run over a child if it goes straight, or it can swerve and run over an adult. So who would say the car should go and kill the child? Almost no one. Okay. Swerve? Okay. I'm interested. So the person who thought it should go straight, was this like an act of, just because this is the default, don't want to intervene? Okay. Yeah, I think there's some kind of, yeah. I think so, because it maxes out at 20, right? Like I think the value of a human being, right? Because I think I was actually presenting this to a bunch of economists, and they thought that, yeah, I think it's a hyperbolic sort of thing, and because the child has not yet been, you haven't invested so much in the child yet at that age. By the time they're 21, there's this, you've spent $2 million or something, or $1 million, with education and all of that. Yeah. So anyway, as it happens, though, most people think the car should swerve in this case. Now, let's have a case with a legal complication. So this is if the car goes straight. So again, the car is empty. If it goes straight, it kills one pedestrian, but this pedestrian is not doing anything wrong. But it can swerve and hit a pedestrian who's jaywalking. So how many people would say let the car go straight? Swerve and kill the jaywalker? Wow. Okay, so okay. So I was going to make a joke about Germans, because I presented this. So 72% of people say swerve in this case in the global sample. I presented this to like a board of a German car maker last year, and the Germans were higher on the swerve. And that was the joke. But you guys are even higher. So so the law is very important in this room, I think. Now, what happens if there were two? So you could swerve and kill the jaywalkers, but there's two jaywalkers versus one legal law-abiding citizen. So how many people would go straight now? Probably a little more. Swerve? Still, wow. Yeah, so in this room, certainly more people would swerve than go straight, which is actually the opposite trend to what we saw. But it's really interesting, right? So this is a different group. Well, first of all, you probably disagree with one another. And the second thing is that different groups of people are giving different answers, different subpopulations. And this is where things get really interesting. But before I get to the data analysis, I want to show you a little video of those YouTubers, like a little montage of the crazy YouTubers who are reacting like you did to this.
The moral machine.
The moral machine.
The moral machine.
The name of the game is Moral Machine. It's not really so much a game as it is a series of ethical dilemmas that a driverless car would have to face.
We show you moral dilemmas, where a driverless car must choose the lesser of two evils, such as killing 2 passengers or 5 pedestrians.
Oh, now this is my kind of test. Start judging. This should be easy.
So this one's simple. What should the self-driving car do? Should it kill 3 occupants, an entire family, or these 2 people here?
So obviously,
You choose the lesser loss of life.
You choose the lesser loss of life.
Yeah.
In my mind, in this scenario, it doesn't matter that it's 1 elderly woman, 1 criminal, and 1 boy. 3 people versus 2 people.
Should we kill less people or should we kill more people?
This is super easy. I thought this would be hard, man.
3 is greater than 2.
What if it was Hitler?
Now we're getting to the tougher questions.
So would you favor the young people who are disobeying the law or old people who is obeying the law?
I would rather it take an action than not.
Now it's getting a little trickier. What should the self-driving car do? Kill the passenger or kill the people?
George Geiser says passengers in the car need to live for the market to continue. I agree.
They're designing the car, right? So you want the car to protect the passenger at all costs.
I would kill the people in the car.
I think the car should default to protecting the people in the vehicle.
I think it should kill the occupants.
Whew, man, these are so intense.
If the car's driving and you can swerve to avoid a pedestrian who maybe wasn't paying attention, it's not your fault, But if you swerve, you're going to go into a wall and might kill yourself. That you can have that machine make that decision, but that's a moral decision, not just a pure utilitarian decision. And who's setting up those rules? Do we have broad consensus around what those rules are? That's going to be important.
So everybody played this, including former president. So, right. So now we've analyzed the data to see what patterns we actually have. And I'm going to show you this plot, which is showing us the difference between the probability of choosing the right-hand side over the left-hand side. Okay, so everything is kind of normalized so that we all start. So 0 is no change. Okay, so this, for example, here we have the variable species. And basically what this says is, if I take an animal, a dog or a cat, and I replace the animal with a human, all else averaged over everything else, all the other variables, because they all covary, right, in our design, then what's the change in probability that I will spare the one on the right over the one on the left? So you can see that humans are 60% more likely to be spared than pets. Okay, and this was the strongest effect that we had, that human life is most important, which you probably would agree with, unless you have pets. Now, the number of characters. So this is what happens if I replace one person with 2 people, or 3 people, or 4 people, and so on. And as you can see, there is a, for one person, there's 33% probability of saving 2 people over 1, or 3 people over 2, so when you add 1 person. But also you notice that there is diminishing marginal returns on the number on more people, which is fascinating. And then these are all the other factors that we had. Again, this is all done using conjoint analysis, and we're averaging over everything else. So we have first of all, you notice the big 3, right? So human life over animal life, more lives, and young lives play the biggest role. And then you have these 2, which are a little bit tricky. One of them is law, so being legal. So legal, a person crossing legally over a person crossing illegally, and social status. So a higher status person is preferred over, let's say, a criminal or a homeless person. And then the others seem to matter much less. I mean, there's still fairly big effect sizes by standards of psychologists, but in relative terms, they're much lower. So people want to spare females, people want to spare fit people, so life expectancy is probably playing a role. And there's also small preference for sparing pedestrians over passengers. Now, if you take individual characters and say, okay, I'm going to use, if you use the adult human, adult male and female, kind of averaged, what's their probability of being spared in a crash? And then you compare a stroller or any other character to them. So if you use them as a baseline, you can see here that a stroller has something like 20 or 18% more likelihood of being spared. And then you could see this done for all of the characters in the moral machine. And there's some really interesting things, like, for example, children are prioritized, pregnant women, doctors, right, are prioritized. And then you have old people don't seem to matter as much. And animals don't matter, and criminals are somewhere between, if you feel between dogs and cats. It's the data, right? I'm not making anything up. So if you're a dog lover, I'm sure you'd be very pleased. So I wanted to contrast these things with the only ethical guidelines that we have today for autonomous vehicles. And this was a study that was commissioned by the German Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure. They formed a committee. The committee is composed of people from, law professors, ethicists, engineering professors, representatives from automotive companies, consumer protection groups, so people who represent consumers, even a Catholic bishop, which makes it sound like a setup for a joke. And a former prosecutor and a judge to chair the commission. And they made recommendations, and these recommendations, basically the government said that they will convert these into law. So they will legislate based on them. Now, I'm going to show you some of the results of their recommendations and contrast them with some of the results that we have in the moral machine. So first of all, humans over pets. The Ethics Commission in Germany says the system must be programmed. Okay, so this is imperative. Must be programmed to accept damage to animals or property if this means personal injury is prevented. So human safety is paramount. So everything is fine. This is consistent. More over fewer. The general programming to reduce the number of personal injuries may be justifiable. So it's not mandated, but it's okay if you do it. So we're still in line with the recommendations. What about this? The Germans they're very sensitive about making any distinctions between people for obvious reasons. In recent history. So any distinction based on personal features, including age, are strictly prohibited. Whereas we have very strong preference, as you've seen, and as you have exhibited, strong preference for protecting children. And I think this is a point where they may get some pushback if they were to legislate this. So this is a case, I would say, where the Ethics Commission disagrees with the data, and you probably side with the data. Now, here's a case where they disagree, but you might side with the Commission. So people say you should prioritize doctors' lives over homeless people, or business people over criminals, and so on. And the German Ethics Commission says you cannot do this, right? So this is a case where many people, you might say, well, we have constitutional rights, and this violates the Constitution by, discriminating systematically against some group. So it's also a cautionary tale, because then, you can't just vote on who lives and who dies and whose life is more important. Maybe sometimes, right? Maybe we should take public opinion into account when considering the lives of children, but not when comparing the lives of adults, for instance. So I'm sure this is not easy to resolve. And finally, lawful over unlawful. The way that they worded it is parties involved in the generation of mobility risks must not sacrifice non-involved parties. So it's something like if you're crossing illegally, then you sort of you did it yourself kind of thing. But it's not clear how this translates to prioritizing the passengers. Because, if by choosing to be in the car, you somehow contributed to the risk, right? So I don't think this is a done deal yet. Okay, so that's kind of the broad result. This is the global survey. But because we had so much data, we're able to do this per country and even finer granularity than this. So you basically take all of those factors, you compute these shifts in probabilities for every single factor per country. And then what this allows you to do is you can have a vector of basically all of the different importances, the relative importance of each factor, right? Of age, of legality, and so on. And then you can cluster things, right? You can cluster the countries. You can use like an unsupervised clustering technique to say, well, which countries are more similar and which countries are more different. We actually used hierarchical clustering, and I'll show you the clustering tree now. And it looks something like this. So what's really fascinating is that it's got three broad clusters. So broadly Western cluster, a broadly Eastern cluster, and a broadly Southern cluster. It's not perfect, but it's very surprisingly sort of accurate categorization of countries. So I just want to zoom a little bit here. If we zoom on the Western cluster, you can see that a lot of the Western countries are in this cluster. You can even see that the data separates, and this is completely bottom up, right? The data separates Catholic from Protestant Europe, right? So you can see a lot of Protestant Northern European countries or Western European countries, like Switzerland, Germany, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, are all in the same subcluster within the Western cluster. And you can see also the Commonwealth countries kind of bunched up together. New Zealand, Australia, and so on. in English-speaking countries, right? Which I find fascinating. Now, this is the Eastern cluster, which has more Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, and Muslim countries. And again, within the cluster, you have structure as well, which is fascinating. Like Japan, Macau, China, and South Korea are all within kind of much closer to one another. And finally, in the southern cluster, you could see that a lot of the South American countries are clustered there, as well as former French colonies. And what's really fascinating is that this is not driven by language. For example, Spain appears in the western cluster next to Portugal, but not next to Argentina or Peru, for example. So what we did next is we said, well, let's look at things at the level of the cluster. So this is the aggregate z-score. So here z equals 0 means you're at the global average. Okay? And then if you're above, then you're above, this country is above the global average with respect to a particular factor. So you can see that the Westerners are more or less, a little along the global average, but they're a bit above global average in their preference for inaction, like not to intervene. Slightly above global average in preferring humans and sparing more people. Utilitarian philosophy was invented in the West, after all, by Jeremy Bentham. Eastern looks very different, the Eastern cluster, right? We have much stronger preference for sparing pedestrians than the global average. Much weaker preference for sparing the young. 1 standard deviation below, right? More than 1 standard deviation below. And slightly more preference for sparing humans, but also much lower preference for sparing the fit. It doesn't matter if you're fit, right? If you have greater life expectancy as much. And now the southern cluster, again, very different. Humans are preferred to a much lower degree, right? So animals seem to matter more in the south. And people in southern countries seem to like women even more, to like sparing women, right? But also sparing higher status people. It's almost 1 standard deviation above the global average, which is fascinating. And you could go on forever analyzing this data. In fact, this paper was done with probably the world's most eminent anthropologist was a co-author of ours because we needed help. So he's based at Harvard. His name is Joe Henrich. And with the help of Joe Henrich, we started doing basically correlating. This is correlational analysis, obviously not causal, but correlating some country-level cultural variables with the results that we're seeing. So, for example, the extent to which you prefer to save more people correlates with individualism in society. So, individualism is a very Western trait. So, this is preferring, that each individual is worth the same and each individual is important, right? The rule of law, which is a kind of a measure of the strength and trust in public institutions and legal institutions, is predictive of sparing the lawful. So in countries, I don't know if you can see some, but you could see a lot of European countries here on the top right. Economic inequality, curiously, predicts the extent to which you favor sparing higher status people. So in countries with greater inequality, people want to spare more higher status individuals. So it may have something to do with the norms that, there's inequality and these people are just more important and that's it. And another interesting observation is this gender gap in health and survival is predictive of sparing females. So basically, if women live longer, then people want to spare them more, right? So again, it's something to do with expectancy, with life expectancy, I think. And this is just the moral machine, the distance from the US. So if you take the US here on the left, and you just order countries by kind of vector distance from the US, you could see something really interesting. You can see all the Western countries are broadly closer to the left. And I don't know, you can look at your favorite countries. You see that Japan is very far, right? Japan, Brunei, and so on. And finally, our measures actually even correlate with genetic distance and with cultural distance as measured by the World Values Survey. So this is all to show that we have signal, we have something here. I just wanted to make a point about when we try to study human behavior, human preferences, and we design systems based on what the public says here, we're missing out, because of those cultural differences that we found, we're missing out on the rest of the world that may be different. And in fact, Joe Henrich, our co-author, wrote one of the most influential papers in anthropology and psychology in recent years, and it's titled "The Weirdest People in the World." And weird here is an acronym. It's actually, he was referring to American undergraduate psychology students, because most of what we know, most of what's published in psychology journals is based on them, because they are the most convenient population. And he's basically saying that they are, Western, industrialized, educated, rich, and democratic. They're weird. They're actually the outlier when you look at the distribution of all kinds of variables. And therefore, we should be very careful generalizing from them. Okay, so we have a little bit of time, I think, to go through some objections. So now that we've kind of made the point, I think, that the problem of regulating machines, the behavior of machines, is not just one of ethics, but it's one of politics. It's of ensuring that people can agree and you can enforce the agreement of some sort. That's the social dilemma story. And the second story was about cultural differences. That, it's very easy, even with a cartoonish sort of scenario like this, you very quickly run into a situation where people disagree because there are conflicts between values, and we disagree on how we resolve those conflicts. And those disagreements can be within one room, but they can also be across cultures. Now, there are some objections you can make at this, and I think it's important to present them and kind of address them. Because you could say, well, this dilemma is too simple. It's simplifying the world too much, or it's astronomically rare. It's not going to happen, therefore, why should we care? Or it's not technically feasible, or it's too early to worry about it. We're not there yet. We're still trying to improve the brakes or whatnot. And finally, this is kind of the elephant in the room. That's why there's an elephant here. And then it might scare people away. That by actually studying it, you're making it more salient that these cars will have to make ethical decisions, and therefore that might scare people from the technology that would otherwise save them. So I just want to kind of take some of these objections and just sort of address them with you. And I would say the astronomically rare, too simple, is probably no better person has expressed this objection, or more intensely this objection, than my colleague, MIT Professor Rodney Brooks, and roboticists. And I'm not going to say it, but you could read for yourself. So this problem is non-existent and irrelevant. Okay, and he actually wrote a whole blog kind of going through this, trying to deconstruct this type of experimentation, right? So, but I think Professor Brooks is taking it literally as an engineer, because he's one of the most successful robotics engineers in history. And he's seeing it as an engineering problem. So he's saying, okay, you're giving me this problem to solve as an engineer, and I just don't see this problem being realistic. When people build cars, they don't face this particular problem. It's a much different problem. And I think he's missing the point that, a philosopher, on the other hand, like Dan Dennett, would see this as an intuition pump. So an intuition pump is something that will help us recognize the important features of a scenario and while removing everything else. And intuition pumps can be extremely helpful in helping us tease out the principles and kind of makes it very difficult for us to hide in the uncertainty or in the complexity, So, of course, he acknowledges that intuition pumps can be abused, but that they can still nonetheless be useful if used correctly. And Patrick Lynn, who's another philosopher who writes about autonomous cars and ethics, kind of makes an analogy between the trolley problem, this kind of dilemma, and a petri dish. That you don't immediately study things in the wild. if you want to understand like how a particular organism reacts to a particular substance, you put them in a petri dish, you put them in idealized conditions that allow you to isolate the effect of one particular chemical compound or intervention, right? Because you're isolating, controlling, and testing certain variables. And then once you do that, then you move up in complexity, and then you see, does this result generalize? Does it hold? Does it have external validity, right? So there's nothing, so as long as we do both exercises, we're fine. I want to show you this now, this example, which kind of takes us one step towards the real world. So here we have a truck, we have a vehicle, let's say it's an autonomous vehicle, and we have a cyclist. Now, today, without autonomous cars, you probably, if you were in this situation, you might instinctively veer a little bit to the left. Just a bit away from this very large truck, right? Because it's just this big, scary thing on your right. But guess what? This would increase the statistical risk to the cyclist, right? Maybe reducing the statistical risk to yourself. Or you could say, no, there's a cyclist. I like cyclists, and I'm going to get even closer to the truck, thus increasing statistical risk to yourself. So if we were to take, and this is nothing fancy. This is not on the face of it, this doesn't look like this ethical conundrum, but it is nonetheless an ethical dilemma. Because the way that you put the software in a car model that gets pushed into 1 million cars, right? In one instance, nothing happens. Over 1 million instances, maybe the car crashes into the truck. Or 10 billion, or whatever, right? Whereas if you program the car to consistently get away from the truck, then you may, over time, statistically hit more cyclists. And this is what we're calling the statistical dilemma, or the statistical trolley dilemma. And this is not a crazy idea. And this is just for lane keeping. So imagine, when do you overtake? How much space do you leave between you and the car in front of you versus the car behind you? And what types of accidents that choice causes? And if you look at one of the early Google patents on the consideration of risks in autonomous vehicles, you see the same kind of logic. So this is a figure from the actual patent. The car here has a truck in front of it that is not moving, and it's trying to make a decision about whether to overtake on a two-way street. And this is an actual table from the patent filing. There are different events, risk penalty, which is the probability of the event, which can be learned easily from those fleets, multiplied by the magnitude of the risk. And the magnitude could be reputational risk or financial liability, right? So this type of logic, this kind of calculation is not insane, right? But it is an ethical dilemma nonetheless, because these bad events have consequences. If you overtake, you're not only endangering yourself, you're also endangering somebody who might be driving on the other side, right? And so on. So I think in that sense, the trolley dilemma is not really as rare as some of the detractors might like to think, because it is more statistical in reality. Another source of these types of trade-offs is the vision system. So this is the last few seconds just before the Uber accident that was very highly popularized in the media. These vision systems failed, for a number of reasons. One of them was that the human was not paying attention. The human was supposed to override. But this is supposed to be an autonomous car. So eventually, it's supposed to do this on its own. And the kinds of errors, so with any algorithm, with a lot of any classification algorithm, there's a trade-off between false positives and false negatives. What's your tolerance to each? So if everything that might look like a human, if you have a low threshold, slows you down, then you're going to have a jittery ride. Okay, so being in the car is going to be uncomfortable. But if you increase that threshold, then once in a while you're going to hit a human. You're going to hit a false positive, right? Or a false negative in this case. So basically, the choices that we make here have, again, impact on trade-offs. In this case, it's a trade-off between comfort and human life. And again, we do this today all the time. Like we have speed limits, right? Speed limits trade off the speed of you getting home from work versus some kind of probability of hitting somebody, right? Or maybe a probability distribution over the kinds of accidents you might be involved in. So I think it's really hard to avoid. And in fact, it is unsolvable in that there is no one correct solution, but it is nonetheless addressable. It's something that we can make a reasoned choice about, just like we did, or just like other parts of the world did with bull bars. So I don't know if you call them bull bars here or something else, these chrome things in front of the car, these chrome big metallic bull bars. So these things are banned in the UK, they're banned in Australia, they're banned in most of Europe. And the reason was a study that showed that they increase statistical risk to pedestrians and to people in other vehicles. Of course, they do increase safety for the person in the vehicle itself. And in this case, the Europeans have made a different choice about trading off values, right? So for them, it was an unacceptable increase in risk to other people, like as a side effect. And it overrides the freedom of the person to protect themselves, right? And I would say, and in the US, it's a different norm, right? I would say in the US, you still are not allowed to put spikes out, sticking out of your car, right? So there are limits. But yeah, we can call it the moose bar dilemma. Okay. Another objection is, let's worry about this later when we actually have autonomous cars on the road. And the problem is that people really want an answer to this question, and they keep asking car makers for an answer. And one of them made the mistake of answering the question. And this was a few years ago. Somebody from Daimler has said, to a Car and Driver magazine in one of the conventions, save the one in the car if you're really sure that you're going to be able to save them, or something like that. And this, the tabloids went after Mercedes and said, you're going to run over children rather than risk, the wealthy people who are riding in Mercedes, right? That was not good for PR, and they quickly, they said it was taken out of context. We withdraw the statement. We're going to do what's legal and what's socially acceptable, and they had no idea what any of this meant, right? No one, because the law didn't catch up, and no one had studied social acceptability of these things, which is kind of one of the motivations behind our work. And some car makers have actually been much more positive about this and much more, they've been discussing this early. So whose lives are going to be saved? If cars are going to be safer, they're going to save lives. How do we distribute those savings? Should cyclists be the beneficiaries? Should the passengers be the sole beneficiaries? How do you distribute those benefits? And the transportation regulators are also beginning to at least pay lip service to this. They acknowledge the existence of these ethical considerations, and they're saying we should pay attention to them. But again, there is no consensus, and we don't have metrics, right, of what social acceptability is or what is deemed ethical. And we hope to contribute to that. And finally, this particular objection that the very act of discussing the dilemma might scare people away is something we took very seriously. I'm not going to get into detail, but I'm just going to say that we ran exposure studies, where we exposed some people to the dilemma and others to something else, and we measured the extent to which they trust the technology or their willingness to ride in cars, and we found strong evidence for a null effect. So this is something that we wanted to make sure that we're not somehow making things worse. So I want to close now before the Q&A by just talking a little bit about this AI ethics as a social contract, this general idea, kind of more broadly, not just about cars. And I think there's a few premises here. And the first premise I want to put forward is that there is a limit to the extent to which we can certify a machine as ethical by looking at its code. So this idea that a scientist sitting somewhere is going to plug something into the code, and read through it and say, okay, I certify this machine is ethical. It's with complex machines, this is no more feasible than it is for you to certify that a human is ethical by giving them an MRI, right? Yet we still consider some people more ethical than others, and we still hold them up to standard. And this is something that we do behaviorally, right? We say, this is the acceptable behavior. I don't care how you think about how you motivate yourself. I don't know how your brain works. But as long as you behave in this way, I'm going to consider you ethical. So we've been pushing for this idea of machine behavior. So we have a paper coming up in Nature in in a month or two, where we're promoting a behavioral perspective on machines, that we should no longer muddle the discussion of AI ethics or regulation or oversight with technical discussions about the inner workings of deep neural networks. I think that may be useful sometimes, but in many cases, all we need to do is make sure that the behavior is the car passes the driving test, the car passes the ethics test, and so on. And this is something we can do much more easily than digging into the code. So going back to these dilemmas and the regulation of those cars, or any machine more generally, now, once we understand what the machines can do, because we looked at their behavior and we kind of profiled their behavior and understood it, and we describe it sort of statistically, we have a model of it, right? Then how do we intervene? There's this idea in human factors called human in the loop. So you have a person like a pilot, a human pilot in the cockpit that is overseeing the works of the autopilot and can intervene at any point. And it looks something like this. You have you have different passengers. They have the same goal. And you have the machine performing its function. And then you have an expert or somebody who's able to watch the machine and sort of intervene. But what we see now is people have different values, right? This is what we saw in the moral machine. And just in the discussions of AI ethics and oversight more generally, different people care about different things. Some people think about economic efficiency or fairness or safety and so on. And this is where we have a different imperative, which is to actually make up our minds about what we want before we ask the machines to do it. And this is what I'm calling society in the loop, in the sense that it's no longer an individual person performing oversight given a clear and uncontroversial, uncontestable set of standards. It's not clear what the standard should be. And there has to be this kind of societal discussion, dialogue, consensus making that is part of this cycle. So in other words, the society in the loop is a human in the loop plus a social contract. Thank you.